The Dark Scrolls. The parchment of memory, brittle and dimmed by centuries of dust, bears the story of a house not yet secure and of a girl not yet queen. In the year when Henry VIII finally breathed his last, England stood trembling between the weight of his legacy and the uncertainty of what would follow. The great monarch, who had reshaped a kingdom and broken the spine of papal authority, left behind not stability but a fragile lattice of heirs, rivals, and ambitions. Into this world stepped Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of the ill-fated Anne Boleyn, scarcely more than a child, yet already hardened by suspicion and sharpened by survival. She entered adolescence as one marked, alternately pitied, feared, and admired, but never simply safe. The household of Catherine Parr, the last queen consort, promised a sanctuary of learning and gentility. Catherine was a woman of letters and devotion, the kind of stepmother who had cultivated a bond with Elizabeth rooted in shared scholarship and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed that the young princess, then not even 15, might find calm after the storms of her father's reign. Yet even in such sanctuaries, danger often lingered, not in the form of overt threats, but in the subtler guise of intimacy. The remarriage of Catherine Parr to Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to the boy King Edward VI, transformed the house into a crucible of power and temptation. And it is within those walls that whispers began, whispers that persist like smoke in the archives of history. Thomas Seymour was not a man without charm. His features, his bearing, and his reckless energy drew eyes wherever he went. Yet his reputation was equally one of imprudence, of ambition carried with too little discretion. To marry Catherine so swiftly after Henry's death was itself a scandal in the eyes of many, a bold claim of proximity to power at a moment when the succession was delicate and every gesture carried consequence. But it was not his political designs alone that etched his name into the secret ledger of Tudor scandal. It was the peculiar attention he bestowed upon the Princess Elizabeth, then in her vulnerable years, that became the matter of enduring unease. The testimonies preserved from that household speak of mornings when Seymour entered Elizabeth's chambers unbidden, of laughter that masked discomfort, of games that transgressed the line between paternal familiarity and something far more perilous. There were accounts of him embracing her, of slapping her playfully, of cutting her dress in jest, as Catherine looked on, first amused, then troubled. To some, these may have seemed the high-spirited liberties of a man too free with his affections. To others, they bore the mark of predation, the early stages of a corruption that threatened both the girl's dignity and the stability of the realm. The truth lies obscured, blurred by the silence of those who lived it, and by the motives of those who later recounted it. The context of the time cannot be ignored. England in the late 1540s was a courtly world, where women, even princesses, had little power to shield themselves from the designs of men. Elizabeth, though daughter of a king, had been branded illegitimate by the convulsions of her father's marital politics. Her place in the succession was tenuous, dependent on the shifting tides of faction and favor. That she was intelligent, precocious, and uncommonly sharp of wit was undeniable. But intelligence did not grant protection. It merely heightened her awareness of the dangers around her. Within Catherine's household, she studied languages, theology, and statecraft, all while navigating the complex attention of Thomas Seymour, whose ambitions reached beyond comfort into perilous desire. The relationship between Catherine Parr and her husband deteriorated under the strain of these incidents. Catherine, at first indulgent of her husband's playful manner with Elizabeth, came at last to perceive he threatened it. Whether motivated by jealousy, by protectiveness, or by political prudence, she made the decision to send Elizabeth away from her household. This removal was not a small matter. It severed the young princess from one of the only stable female influences she had known, casting her once more into uncertainty. Yet it also shielded her from what might have grown into a scandal impossible to contain. For the longer Elizabeth remained under Seymour's gaze, the greater the risk that rumor would calcify into public belief. Those rumors, however, had already taken root. Gossip in Tudor England was no mere pastime. It was a weapon, a shadow court in which reputations were built and destroyed. Whispers that Elizabeth had been compromised circulated quietly but persistently. Some suggested she might have been seduced, others that she had been assaulted, still others that she carried a hidden child. No document confirms these suspicions. No cradle was ever produced, no evidence tangible enough to satisfy historians. Yet the very absence of proof has not extinguished the speculation. In the void left by silence, imagination flourishes, and the figure of the Virgin Queen, as Elizabeth would later be known, emerges paradoxically from a youth clouded by questions of chastity and scandal. It is essential to recognize that these events were not occurring in isolation. The boy king, Edward VI, was young, and the realm was governed by regents and councillors locked in their own contests of supremacy. Thomas Seymour himself harbored designs upon higher station, restless beneath the authority of his elder brother, the Lord Protector Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. Ambition burned in him as brightly as desire. To align himself with Elizabeth, to place himself in proximity to the princess who might yet inherit the throne, was no mere dalliance. It was strategy, calculated or instinctive, to secure a foothold in the future of England's crown. That his methods were reckless does not diminish the possibility that he understood the stakes. For in the volatile arithmetic of Tudor succession, every marriage, every alliance, was a potential path to sovereignty. Elizabeth, though young, was not naive. She had been raised amid betrayal, had witnessed the downfall of her mother, and had grown in the shadow of her father's ruthless temper. The lessons of survival were etched into her character. When questioned later about her dealings with Seymour, her responses were measured, cautious, crafted to protect herself. Whether she had been merely the target of his inappropriate familiarity or whether something deeper had transpired, she did not allow confession to condemn her. She learned early to guard her words, to shape her image, to become the mistress of silence when speech would wound. In these formative years, the seeds of her later political acumen were sown, the art of appearing untouched while storms raged unseen. Catherine Parr's death in 1548 further dedicated the tale. Having given birth to a daughter, she succumbed soon after, leaving Thomas Seymour a widower. With Catherine gone, Seymour's attention turned with less restraint toward Elizabeth. He sought to secure her hand in marriage, a union that would have scandalized England, but that might have placed him at the very threshold of kingship. Such a prospect alarmed those in power. To marry Elizabeth was to claim intimacy with the royal line, to wield influence that could unseat existing guardians of the boy king. It was too great a risk for those already wary of Seymour's restless ambition. His arrest followed, and with it interrogations, accusations, and ultimately his downfall. In 1549, he was executed for treason, his designs cut short by the axe, leaving Elizabeth once again free of his shadow, but not of the whispers he had left behind. The story of Thomas Seymour and Elizabeth thus lingers not in what can be definitively proved, but in what remains unresolved. Was Elizabeth a victim, a participant, or merely a bystander to a man's folly? Was the scandal exaggerated by rivals seeking to destroy Seymour, or did it conceal truths too dangerous to confess? The fragments that survive in letters, in testimonies, in the cautious recollections of those who knew, allow us only glimpses, never certainty. And yet, these glimpses are enough to shape an enduring narrative. That in her earliest years, Elizabeth confronted the peril of male ambition in its most intimate and disquieting form, and that she emerged from it with the wary resolve that would define her reign. As the manuscript of history unfolds, one cannot help but imagine the scene. The young princess at her studies, a man's shadow falling across her chamber door, laughter ringing too loudly in the morning air, the wary eyes of a stepmother torn between complicity and concern. These are images not easily dismissed, for they contain within them the essence of Tudor intrigue, the mingling of personal desire with the politics of succession, the inseparability of household scandal from the fate of a kingdom. In this tension lies the haunting power of the story, a reminder that the path to monarchy is rarely paved in innocence, but rather in compromise, rumor, and the silence of those who must endure. Elizabeth would go on to become the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana of England's golden age, the monarch who mastered her image so thoroughly that she could stand as both untouchable and beloved. Yet the memory of her youth, clouded by the shadow of Thomas Seymour, offers a counterpoint to the legend. It reveals the fragility that underlies power, the dangers faced even by those destined for greatness, and the ambiguity of narratives shaped not by what is certain, but by what is feared, suspected, and whispered. The record closes not with clarity but with suggestion, leaving us to ponder whether in the earliest chapters of her life, Elizabeth's sovereignty was forged not only in study and resolve, but in the crucible of unwanted attention and perilous rumor. The hush of mourning for Queen Catherine Parr had scarcely settled when new currents of unease began to stir. Her death, brought on by childbed fever in the weeks after delivering a daughter, left Thomas Seymour unmoored, stripped of the tempering influence of a woman who had at least tried to restrain his recklessness. He was now a widower, and with Catherine's passing, the delicate balance that had preserved a measure of propriety in his household collapsed. It is in this moment, amid loss and ambition, that the gaze of Thomas Seymour fell more intently upon Elizabeth, who at 15 was vulnerable not only as a young girl, but also as a princess standing in dangerous proximity to the throne. The air of impropriety that had surrounded his earlier games with her now darkened into speculation of something bolder. Seymour had never been a man to content himself with half measures. His very career was littered with evidence of overreach, his impatience with his elder brother's authority, a Lord Protector, his maneuvering among factions at court, his restlessness with any position short of supremacy. In Elizabeth he saw not merely beauty or youth, but a means to alter his destiny. To claim her hand in marriage would be to align himself with the bloodline of kings, to stand at the gateway of sovereignty. For a man so driven, the barriers of propriety, law, and consent mattered less than the glittering prize he imagined awaiting him. Elizabeth, however, was no ordinary ward. Though still in her mid-teens, she had already cultivated the sharpness of a survivor. She knew what it was to be cast into peril by rumor, as she had been when her mother fell under the axe. She understood the cost of scandal, for illegitimacy had once stripped her of the style of princess, and she was not blind to the attentions of Seymour, nor to the dangers they implied. Yet she was constrained, too young to defy outright, too dependent upon those around her to withdraw entirely. Her response was one of careful words, studied caution, and a deliberate cultivation of silence. This strategy, born of necessity, would become her hallmark as a ruler in later years. But now, it was simply the means of survival. Whispers thickened. Some alleged that Elizabeth's removal from Catherine's household had not come soon enough, that damage had already been done. Others claimed that the princess had been spirited away not to protect her innocence, but to conceal the evidence of its loss. Stories of a hidden pregnancy began to circulate in hushed tones, spoken with the breathless certainty of scandal, yet supported by no verifiable proof. No child was ever produced, no record of a birth ever discovered, but the suggestion proved impossible to extinguish. The more improbable the rumor, the more tenaciously it clung. For in a court addicted to intrigue, denial often confirmed suspicion rather than dispelling it. The wider political stage magnified the peril of such tales. England was under the governance of the Regency Council, with Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, at its head. His authority, though formidable, was embattled, for rival factions eyed him with envy and resentment. Thomas, his younger brother, nursed a ceaseless dissatisfaction, forever overshadowed by Somerset's command. He sought avenues to power that circumvented his brother's dominance, and the prospect of marriage to Elizabeth offered precisely that. With her hand, he could claim the mantle of protector in his own right, positioning himself as a guardian, and perhaps more, of a girl who might one day inherit the crown. His overtures, however, betrayed his desperation, and in a court sensitive to any shift in allegiance, desperation was indistinguishable from treason. The interrogations that followed Seymour's arrest illuminate the dangers Elizabeth faced. Servants were questioned, their testimonies recorded in tones that veered between scandalized and evasive. Some spoke of mornings when Seymour lingered too long in the princess's chamber, of embraces too familiar, of Catherine Parr's uneasy interventions. Elizabeth herself was compelled to respond, though even in youth she exhibited the instinct for self-preservation that would later become legendary. Her words were measured, denying impropriety without offering fuel for accusation. She maintained a careful line between admitting what could not be denied, Seymour's presence, his jests, and rejecting what might destroy her reputation. It was the performance of a girl who understood that her survival depended not upon truth alone, but upon the mastery of narrative. Seymour's downfall was swift once suspicion hardened into action. He was accused not only of inappropriate designs upon Elizabeth, but also of conspiring to seize the person of the boy king Edward VI, a plot that bespoke both audacity and folly. His enemies needed little encouragement to bring charges, for his recklessness had provided ample grounds. In early 1549 he was condemned, and soon after he went to the block. With his death, the immediate danger to Elizabeth dissipated, but the shadow of his attentions lingered. For the rest of her life, the story of Seymour hovered at the edges of her legend, never confirmed, never erased. The deeper consequence, however, lay in what the episode imprinted upon Elizabeth's psyche. In these formative years, she learned that intimacy could be weaponized, that affection could mask ambition, that the private could never be divorced from the political. She grasped that her body, her reputation, her very identity were battlegrounds upon which others sought advantage. The lesson was bitter, but it fortified her resolve to remain mistress of herself, to guard her autonomy with unyielding vigilance. If later she styled herself the Virgin Queen, it was not only a pose of sanctity, but a shield forged from the recognition that marriage, love, even desire, could enslave her to the ambitions of men like Seymour. It is tempting, Ken 2 reads later, to draw conclusions about what precisely transpired between the princess and the reckless lord. Did their interactions cross the line into violation? Was Elizabeth truly endangered, or were her enemies seizing upon fragments to blacken Seymour's name? Did the whispers of pregnancy conceal an actual scandal, or were they no more than the invention of tongues eager to defame? The surviving record offers no definitive answer, only glimpses refracted through the motives of those who wrote them. Yet the ambiguity itself is instructive, for in that ambiguity, Elizabeth found the necessity of controlling her image. She learned that silence could be more powerful than denial, that restraint could be a weapon sharper than accusation. In this crucible of rumor and peril, her political genius began to take shape. The figure of Seymour, meanwhile, remains both pathetic and dangerous in retrospect. A man of striking presence and undeniable charisma, he squandered his gifts through impatience, science, and vanity. His desire to eclipse his brother consumed him. His inability to recognize limits doomed him. His entanglement with Elizabeth, whether flirtation or something darker, was symptomatic of a larger pattern, the conflation of personal ambition with political opportunity, heedless of consequence. His execution was thus less the tragedy of a noble wronged than the inevitable result of a nature unable to discipline itself. Yet even in disgrace, he left behind the memory of danger that had brushed close to the future queen, shaping the mythology that would surround her. In the broader arc of English history, the Seymour affair underscores the volatility of the Tudor succession. The throne was never merely a seat of majesty, but a magnet for intrigue, a prize that drew both loyalty and betrayal in equal measure. Elizabeth, as a girl, became the object of schemes before she possessed any authority of her own. In surviving them, she internalized the precariousness of power and the need to cloak vulnerability beneath an impenetrable facade. This was not a lesson she would forget, and its traces can be discerned in the deliberate ambiguity of her reign, in the cultivated image of a queen wedded to her kingdom, but to no man. What remains, then, is the haunting interplay of fact and rumor, of testimony and silence. The chronicles preserve enough detail to convince us that something troubling occurred, yet not enough to fix its contours with certainty. The archives whisper of impropriety, of schemes, of dangers skirted but not fully disclosed. And in that whisper lies the enduring fascination, that the Virgin Queen, symbol of chastity and sovereignty, emerged from a youth clouded by the very scandals she would later transcend. The silence she maintained became the silence of history itself, a silence that invites us to ponder, but denies us closure. Thus the record closes on a chapter both incomplete and essential. Thomas Seymour fell, his ambitions extinguished. Elizabeth endured, her resilience sharpened. Out of scandal she forged strategy, out of danger she fashioned resolve. And though the manuscripts offer only fragments, those fragments suggest the birth of a monarch who would learn, from the reckless grasp of a man undone, the necessity of mastery over self, over story, and over the shadows that forever circle the throne. The silence that followed the fall of Thomas Seymour was not the silence of peace, but of unease. His head had rolled beneath the blade in 1549, yet the echoes of his reckless pursuit lingered long after his body was gone. For Elizabeth, barely into her teens, the execution did not erase the memory of peril. Instead, it confirmed that proximity to ambition was as dangerous as ambition itself. She had escaped unscathed in law, yet not in reputation. What had transpired in Catherine Parr's household, what rumors whispered of concealed intimacy, of pregnancies hushed into nothingness, remained unproven. But proof was scarcely necessary in a court where insinuation often bore the weight of truth. The council had interrogated her closely in the wake of Seymour's arrest, pressing her for admissions she refused to yield. She had emerged with her position intact, but she had learned an indelible lesson, that words could bind as surely as shackles, and that survival demanded the careful art of withholding. From that time forward, she crafted her replies with the delicacy of one who knew every syllable might be turned against her. Her youth had ended abruptly, not in years, but in the sharpening of caution. Yet the world into which she matured offered little respite. The boy-king Edward VI, her half-brother, sat upon the throne, a monarch in name but not in command. The true governance of England lay in the hands of regents and councillors, men who weighed succession as both shield and weapon. Elizabeth's presence in that line, however far down, made her simultaneously valuable and perilous. If she were to marry unwisely, she might carry the crown into the hands of a rival faction. If she were to fall under suspicion, she might become the pretext for purges and imprisonments. In such a climate, her earlier entanglement with Seymour was remembered, not as an isolated indiscretion, but as a warning that she was a node of danger, a figure around whom plots might cluster. Elizabeth's education continued with vigor during these years, but always in the shadow of vigilance. Her tutors remarked upon her intelligence, her mastery of languages, her eloquence in both speech and writing. She absorbed theology and rhetoric, the chronicles of the past and the subtleties of governance. Yet behind her scholarship lay the stern awareness that knowledge was not ornament but armor. To defend herself from accusation, she must be articulate. To guard her future, she must be cunning. Where Seymour had once tested her with the familiarity of a man who believed her powerless, she now resolved never again to appear vulnerable. The reign of Edward VI was short, his health fragile, his council fractured by rivalries. As the boy sickened, the question of succession sharpened into crisis. The memory of Seymour's attempt to seize advantage was recalled in the frantic jockeying of lords who sought to shape the future. Elizabeth, by virtue of her blood, was inevitably drawn into the calculations. Her silence in these years was itself a statement. She aligned with no faction too boldly, promised nothing, committed to nothing, and in so doing made herself both enigmatic and indispensable. But shadows lengthened again with the death of Edward in 1553. The throne passed not to Elizabeth, but to her elder half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Mary's accession was marked by turbulence. The attempt to install Lady Jane Grey quickly crushed. The restoration of Catholicism proclaimed. For Elizabeth, the new queen's reign posed a new labyrinth of danger. She was now heir presumptive, a Protestant figure in a realm reoriented toward Rome. In her body and name lay the possibility of rebellion, whether she willed it or not. And in every whisper of discontent, in every murmur of conspiracy, her presence could be invoked as justification. The story of Thomas Seymour resurfaced in this climate as an unquiet ghost. For enemies of Elizabeth, the scandal of her youth could be painted as evidence of her moral frailty, her unfitness for trust. For allies, it was invoked as proof of her capacity to survive intrigue unbroken. Either way, it ensured that her name could never escape the context of rumor. When Mary's government confronted rebellions, such as the Wyatt Rising, Elizabeth was implicated by association. She was seized, examined, and even imprisoned in the Tower, the same fortress where her mother had awaited execution. Within those walls, she came face to face with the ultimate consequence of suspicion, the possibility that a crown could order her death. Her comportment in those days was consistent with the habits she had learned since Seymour's attentions had first endangered her. She denied knowledge of treason, yet not in tones of desperation. She appealed to her loyalty, her innocence, but never yielded information that might entangle her further. Like before, she used restraint as shield, offering neither confession nor rash defiance. To her Hailers, she was a puzzle, too cautious to incriminate, too poised to appear cowed. It was a performance honed by years of knowing how easily words could be twisted, how quickly affection could sour into accusation. Mary eventually released her, whether from lack of evidence or from political calculation. But the lesson was once again seared into Elizabeth's being. Trust was a currency she could afford only in the smallest measures. The hand of friendship might conceal the blade of betrayal. Even within family, blood was no guarantee of safety. She had seen her father discard wives and daughters alike. Her brother's counselors sacrifice allies for advantage. Her sister imprison her without proof. And before all of this, she had felt the peril of a man whose touch blurred the line between play and violation. Each episode reinforced the same principle. Survival required not only intelligence, but the ability to remain inscrutable. As Mary's reign advanced, the question of succession became ever more urgent. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain did not produce the longed-for heir. False pregnancies further undermined the sense of stability. In this vacuum, Elizabeth's claim grew stronger, her figure more luminous to Protestants who longed for deliverance. Yet with that light came renewed danger. For those who wished to see her destroyed worked tirelessly to paint her as unchaste, unreliable, a woman marked by scandal since her youth. Seymour's ghost was never far from such insinuations. The rumors of a child, the tales of compromised virtue, were revived whenever her enemies needed to blacken her image. What made these insinuations all the more perilous was their resonance with the culture of the time. A woman's chastity was not merely personal, but political. To be seen as compromised was to forfeit credibility, to render her claim to power suspect. That Elizabeth nonetheless ascended the throne in 1558 is testimony not to the disappearance of these rumors, but to her ability to neutralize them through sheer command of persona. She presented herself not as a woman wounded by scandal, but as a sovereign untouched by it, her virginity a metaphor for incorruptibility. The very story that had once threatened to destroy her became the foundation for a mythology that set her apart. In retrospect, the through line is clear. From the reckless intrusions of Thomas Seymour to the interrogations of the Tower, Elizabeth fashioned her character from fire. She learned that in silence lay strength, that in ambiguity lay survival, that in controlling her own image lay the essence of sovereignty. Where others perished in the snares of ambition, she endured by refusing to let ambition define her. Seymour had sought to use her as a means to power. She refused to let herself be reduced to a means for anyone. The price of this resolve was solitude, but the reward was the throne. And so, when she became queen, the title she embraced, Virgin, was more than a denial of marriage.
It was an act of reclamation. The girl who had been whispered about as pregnant, who had been suspected of surrendering her virtue to a reckless lord, now stood as the woman who belonged to no man, whose body and reign were inseparable. The irony is sharp. The scandal that might have destroyed her instead made possible her most enduring political invention. Yet the memory of what had nearly undone her never faded. In private, she remained wary. In public, she remained inscrutable. And in the chronicles she left behind the impression of a monarch who, from her earliest years, had learned that intimacy and power were threads woven with blood and danger. The manuscript of her youth, then, is not one of innocence lost or preserved, but of power forged. Every rumor, every imprisonment, every brush with betrayal hardened her into the sovereign she would become. And at the center of it all, the specter of Thomas Seymour remains, not as the defining relationship of her life, but as the first test she passed, the first storm she weathered, the first shadow she turned into strength. It is this paradox that gives the story its haunting quality, that the Virgin Queen was shaped, in part, by the scandal of her near defilement, that from whispers she made silence, and from silence, rule. When Mary Tudor's final days approached, the kingdom braced itself for a change that seemed at once inevitable and perilous. The Queen's body, wasted by illness and phantom pregnancies, could no longer sustain the hope of an heir. Into the void of expectation stepped Elizabeth, the daughter once branded illegitimate, the young woman once whispered about in connection with scandal, the princess who had survived suspicion, imprisonment, and the treacherous labyrinth of courtly intrigue. The throne was hers in 1558, not because the rumors had ceased, but because the weight of her claim could no longer be denied. Yet even as she received the crown, she carried within her the memories of those who had sought to control her, the ghost of Seymour among them, a silent reminder that sovereignty required not merely possession, but vigilance. The coronation was a pageant of triumph, a deliberate assertion that the new queen belonged not to factions, not to foreign powers, but to England itself, one. In her procession, she displayed the grace of a monarch, yet tempered it with the humility of one who knew how fragile power could be. She had learned in the hardest school that every gesture was political, that every word might bind or liberate. The image of Elizabeth that emerged in those first years was not accidental. It was constructed, as carefully as any fortress, from the lessons of her youth. She would trust no man to define her, no marriage to claim her, no scandal to destroy her. She had watched Seymour fall to the axe because he reached too greedily. She would ensure no one could ever say the same of her. It is telling that the first and most persistent question of her reign was whether she would marry. Ambassadors pressed, counselors begged, suitors circled like hawks. For contemporaries, the idea of a virgin queen was unnatural, even perilous. The union of her body with another's was seen as a necessity for the union of the realm. Yet Elizabeth resisted, not with outright refusal, but with the same studied ambiguity that had protected her as a girl. She entertained suitors without choosing them, promised without committing, dangled prospects without delivering. Her court became a theater of potential alliances, each more dazzling and futile than the last. By this performance, she bought time, secured loyalty, and preserved her independence. Marriage, which Seymour had once sought to exploit as his ladder to power, became the very institution she withheld to maintain hers. The echoes of scandal remained, for enemies did not forget. Pamphlets and whispers questioned her virtue, insinuated lovers, painted her as a woman of appetite beneath the mask of chastity. But Elizabeth had mastered the art of transmutation. The very qualities once used against her, she elevated into symbols of sovereignty. Virginity ceased to be a mere state of body. It became a sacred metaphor, an embodiment of incorruptibility. Where others saw absence, she proclaimed devotion, not to a husband, but to her people. By binding her image to the notion of the Virgin Queen, she rewrote the narrative that had once cast her as compromised. Seymour's shadow could not erase her. Instead, it became the negative space against which her light was defined. Her reign unfolded as a balancing act. Each policy, each gesture, shaped by the understanding that perception was as vital as decree. Foreign ambassadors marveled at her command of language, her ability to flatter and deflect in equal measure. She spoke with charm, yet concealed her intentions. She promised generously, yet yielded nothing essential. These were the same arts she had honed in youth, when counselors pressed her for admissions about Seymour. She had learned then that the difference between survival and ruin lay in the cadence of a reply, in the precision of restraint. As queen, she elevated those instincts into statecraft. It was not only in diplomacy that she wielded this mastery. At home, her reign required constant vigilance against plots and rival claimants. Mary, Queen of Scots, stood as a living reminder that legitimacy was contested. Catholic Europe regarded Elizabeth as a heretic, a usurper, an interloper to be deposed. Within England itself, conspiracies brewed, some real, some imagined. In this climate, the old whispers of her girlhood could be repurposed, painted anew as evidence of weakness. Yet Elizabeth's strategy was consistent. She did not deny rumors with rage, for rage gave them substance. She met them instead with the dignity of silence, or with the careful redirection of meaning. A queen who could not be pinned down was a queen who could not be undone. The mythology of Gloriana, of Astria returned to earth, of a monarch untouchable and eternal, did not spring from accident. It was cultivated, nurtured, and broadcast, not merely by poets and courtiers, but by Elizabeth herself. She encouraged the iconography that set her apart as singular, beyond ordinary womanhood. Traits displayed her youth long after age had lined her face, adorned her with symbols of purity and empire, cloaked her in allegory. This was the armor she wore in place of a husband's protection. Where Seymour had once reduced her to a girl vulnerable in her chamber, Elizabeth remade herself as an image so elevated that intimacy itself seemed profane. In this sense, every brushstroke of her portraits, every verse sung in her praise, was a defiance of the scandal that once threatened to consume her. Her reign was not free of blood or tragedy. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the defeats and triumphs of war, the religious divisions that scarred the land, all demanded decisions of ruthless consequence. Yet through it all, Elizabeth retained the aura of control, the sense that she answered to none but her own conscience and her God. Observers marveled that she had no husband to guide her, no consort to temper her, no children to distract her. To some, this was a flaw. To others, it was the very secret of her endurance. What they could not perceive was that it was also a shield forged in her youth, when a reckless man had taught her how dangerous dependence could be. In private, perhaps, the memory of Seymour returned to her in moments of reflection. The girl who had been teased and compromised, who had felt the precariousness of her station, could not entirely forget. Yet she never allowed that memory to dominate her reign. Instead, she wielded it as a silent teacher, a reminder of what she must never allow again. She knew that to bind herself to a man was to risk her throne, her dignity, her very life. She had seen too many women destroyed by marriage, too many queens undone by intimacy. Catherine Howard, beheaded for adultery. Catherine Parr, dead in childbed after yielding to Seymour's passion. Even her own mother, Anne Boleyn, cut down by charges of infidelity. The pattern was clear, the danger real. Elizabeth resolved to escape it, and in doing so became unique among monarchs of her age. As the years advanced, the cult of the Virgin Queen grew into a cornerstone of England's identity. Festivals, sermons, poems, and masques all extolled her as the embodiment of the nation itself. To her subjects, she became not merely a ruler, but a symbol, a living myth whose body was indistinguishable from the body politic. This conflation was deliberate, a political invention that drew upon her early trials. By erasing the possibility of private scandal, by absorbing her femininity into the fabric of sovereignty, Elizabeth ensured that her authority could not be challenged on the grounds that had once endangered her. In the end, Seymour's ghost served only to remind her of what she had overcome, a spectre absorbed into the radiance of the legend she crafted. Yet history, for all its admiration, retains its shadows. Scholars still debate what passed in Catherine Parr's house, what Elizabeth endured, what she concealed. The answers remain elusive in the silences she cultivated. But perhaps that is the truest reflection of her genius. For Elizabeth understood, as few have, that power lies not in the disclosure of truth, but in its management. She allowed enough to be seen to inspire loyalty, enough to be concealed to preserve autonomy. Her reign, like her youth, was built upon the art of living in rumor's shadow, without letting rumor consume her. Thus the story circles back upon itself. The girl, endangered by a man's ambition, became the woman who denied all men access to her throne. The princess, whispered about as compromised, became the queen exalted as incorruptible. The laughter of Seymour in her chamber, the whispers of scandal that followed, the interrogations she endured, all were transmuted into the iron discipline of a sovereign who would outlast her enemies and shape an age. The documents of her reign shine with triumph, but beneath them lies the palimpsest of her youth, the faint yet indelible impression of how peril was turned into power. The final decades of Elizabeth's reign unfolded as both triumph and burden. She had steered England through storms of religion and war, had repelled the great armada of Spain, and had cultivated a golden age of letters and exploration that set her realm apart from the tumults of the continent. Yet beneath the pageantry and the polished myth of Gloriana lay the solitude of a woman who had chosen, perhaps been compelled, to live apart. The court celebrated her as Virgin Queen, a sovereign married to her kingdom, but the silence that framed this myth carried with it the echo of earlier shadows. For behind the tapestry of magnificence lingered the memory of dangers faced in youth, dangers that had taught her never to yield herself to another. As she aged, Elizabeth's refusal to marry remained both her strength and her torment.
Foreign envoys no longer pressed their princes upon her hand, but domestic voices continued to murmur about succession. With no heir of her body, the future of England was uncertain, and the anxiety of what would follow her haunted her counsels. Some praised her constancy, others condemned her stubbornness, but few understood that this choice was not merely the whim of a proud queen. It was the culmination of lessons learned in peril, that to bind herself in matrimony was to surrender the very autonomy that preserved her reign. The memory of Seymour's reckless pursuit, the knowledge of how easily intimacy could become a chain, shaped her refusal as much as policy or principle. The mythology of virginity became, in these later years, a double-edged sword. To her subjects, she was exalted as a figure beyond ordinary humanity, a living emblem of the nation's purity and divine favor. Festivals crowned her with allegory. Poets sang of her as Astrea, the virgin goddess returned to earth. Yet to Elizabeth herself, the role demanded a denial of personal desire, a relentless vigilance against any whisper that might pierce the image she had so carefully
sustained. She had built her sovereignty on silence, but silence is also loneliness. In the long nights of her later reign, one may imagine that the queen reflected on the cost of her survival. A crown secured, a legacy assured, but at the price of a life lived in guarded solitude. Her courtiers grew old around her, and one by one they passed away. The men who had once been her companions, perhaps even her intimates, Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, Francis Walsingham, either died, fell from grace, or were executed. Each loss left her more alone, more conscious of time's erosion. Yet she did not falter in the role she had chosen. The mask of Gloriana remained firmly in place, the image of incorruptible sovereignty never allowed to slip. Even as her beauty faded, portraits continued to display her as youthful and radiant, symbols surrounding her body to proclaim her eternal virginity and undiminished power. The myth had outgrown the woman, but Elizabeth understood that myth was her grandmother. Elitist defense. Still, the old rumors never fully disappeared. In taverns and secret gatherings, whispers continued that the queen was no virgin, that her youth had been compromised, that her body concealed histories never confessed. The story of Seymour resurfaced in these murmurings, a tale retold with variations, each more salacious than the last. Some claimed she had borne a hidden child, others that she had yielded to lovers in secrecy. None could prove their words, yet the very persistence of such tales testifies to their deep roots in the memory of her people. Ironically, the myth of virginity, so loudly proclaimed, invited disbelief, and disbelief turned again to Seymour, the first man to leave his imprint upon her legend. Elizabeth herself never gave fuel to these rumors. She answered them not with denial but with majesty. In her speeches to Parliament, in her addresses to her people, she spoke not as a woman defending her chastity, but as a monarch asserting her union with it. Her realm. "I am married to England," she declared, and in those words erased the question of personal virtue by replacing it with political devotion. Yet behind the resounding cadence lay the faint shadow of necessity. She could not have proclaimed such union had she not first survived the peril of Seymour's pursuit. The myth of the Virgin Queen was born not in triumph, but in danger, not in innocence preserved, but in innocence questioned. As her reign drew towards its end, Elizabeth faced the inevitability of succession without heir. The childless queen, so fiercely protective of her autonomy, left behind a kingdom anxious for continuity. The choice of James of Scotland as her successor was pragmatic, but it underscored the paradox of her legacy.
She had given England stability in life, but uncertainty in death. Yet even this did not diminish her stature in the eyes of her people. By the time she breathed her last in 1603, she had ruled for 45 years, a span so long that many had known no other monarch. Her reign had become synonymous with England itself, her image indistinguishable from the nation's glory. In death, the whispers did not cease. Historians and chroniclers, poets and pamphleteers continued to debate the mysteries of her youth. Some sought to sanctify her, portraying her as the perfect maiden sovereign, untouched by scandal. Others could not resist reopening the tale of Seymour, speculating on what might have passed behind closed doors, what truths Elizabeth had carried to the grave. The absence of proof ensured that speculation flourished, for where silence reigns, imagination fills the void. Thus her legacy remains entwined with ambiguity, a queen celebrated for purity, yet shadowed by rumor, a monarch exalted for autonomy, yet haunted by the memory of a man who once endangered her. The paradox of Elizabeth's life is that her greatest strength was also her greatest sacrifice. By denying herself intimacy, she denied herself the comfort of partnership, the joy of children, the solace of trust. Yet in so doing, she secured a reign unmatched in its endurance and its splendor. The girl who once trembled beneath Seymour's gaze became the woman who defied kings, popes, and empires. The princess whispered about in scandal became the sovereign who wrote her legend upon the fabric of history. Her silence, her restraint, her careful cultivation of image, all forged in the crucible of youthful peril, became the foundation of her monarchy. And so, when one reads the brittle parchments of Tudor history, when one traces the faded ink of interrogations and testimonies, one cannot escape the conclusion that Elizabeth's story is incomplete without Seymour. Not because she loved him, not because he defined her, but because his reckless ambition forced her to learn, at so tender an age, how perilous the world could be. He was the shadow against which she defined herself, the danger that taught her vigilance, the scandal that compelled her to master silence. Without him, perhaps she might have been different, less guarded, less calculating, more open to marriage and intimacy. But without him, she might also have been destroyed, consumed by the same fate that devoured so many women of her house. The legend of Elizabeth is therefore not a tale of innocence untouched, but of danger overcome. It is not the story of a virgin preserved, but of a queen who turned rumor into armor. Seymour sought to use her for his ends, but in the end it was she who used the memory of him to fortify her reign. In every portrait where she appears as eternal maiden, in every speech where she proclaims devotion to her people, there lingers, unseen, the faint outline of the man who first threatened her. His ghost remains, not triumphant, but vanquished, a reminder that out of scandal can emerge sovereignty, and out of peril, power. Thus the manuscript closes. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Astria, sovereign of England's golden age, carried to her grave secrets never spoken, wounds never confessed, rumors never silenced. History may never know the truth of what passed between her and Thomas Seymour. But history does not need certainty to be haunted. It is enough that the whispers remain, that the silence endures, that the shadow of a reckless man still flickers at the edges of a queen's immortal legend. For in that shadow we glimpse not weakness, but the crucible in which a monarch was forged, a crucible that turned a girl endangered into a woman enthroned. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.